right, I'm recording. So welcome everyone. This is the first webinar of 2026. Interestingly, it's the start of the 20th year of the Forest Connect webinar series, so I appreciate you all being here. And I'm really grateful for Claire Mann, who's joining us as the presenter. Claire works for Audubon, New York. She hails from Western New York, got a degree from SUNY ESF, the SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry in Syracuse in 2015, and spent some time working as an environmental educator with the U.S. Forest Service before joining Audubon. So with that, and she's going to be obviously from the screen talking about habitat management for forest birds. Um, with that, I'm going to turn off my mic and my video and just let Claire run with it. So if you all have questions, type them into the chat window. Make sure you share them to everyone, and then we will get to those questions at the end. So Claire, thank you for joining us. You've brought in a great big crowd, and that's all the more fun. So it's all yours.
Awesome. Thank you, Peter. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. As Peter mentioned, my name is Claire Mann. I am the Forest Program Senior Associate for Audubon, New York. So I work all across the state, but with a primary focus on improving forest bird breeding habitat. I do that through a number of things, a lot of outreach and education, technical assistance to private landowners. We also do a lot of work with foresters and other land managers. And I'll highlight some of the programs that I work on towards the end of the presentation today, but really excited to talk to you about habitat management for forest birds. While I'm presenting, I'm going to turn my video off just so nobody experiences a lag, but I'll turn it back on at the end for questions. So we will jump right in. So today we're going to talk about Audubon as an organization. In case you're not familiar with the work that we do, we'll talk about forest bird population declines and why there's a need for us to do the work that we do. We'll get into forest age class diversity, how that plays into habitat. We'll talk about how we assess habitat at both the landscape and the stand level. And then I'll wrap up today talking about some of the programs that we have in the forest program, as well as some funding opportunities we have available for landowners and land managers. And then we'll have time at the end for Q&A. So for those of you who are not familiar, Audubon is a conservation nonprofit organization whose mission is to protect birds in the places that they need today and tomorrow. We work throughout the Americas using science, advocacy, education, and on-the-ground conservation. We're a pretty large organization. We have a number of state and regional offices. We have almost 500 local chapters. We have college campus chapters, nature centers, and sanctuaries, and we all work together to kind of carry out this mission. Now, I work for Audubon, Connecticut, and New York, technically, which is a regional office, and I work for our forest program, where we're really focused on enhancing forest bird habitat. So I like to share this map to show kind of forest cover across the US. You can see that in the Northeast, we live in a very heavily forested area, and these forests are really important for birds as they act as breeding habitat, migratory habitat, stopover habitat, as well as wintering habitat. And unfortunately, what we know is that the birds that rely on these forests are experiencing population decline. So we'll talk a lot about that today. And the one thing that I want to highlight as we think about managing and helping birds with these declines is that New York State is primarily privately owned. About 75% of our forests are privately owned. So as we think about addressing challenges or think about implementing forest management, it's really important to highlight the need to work with private landowners, which is a big focus of what I do with Audubon. So getting into why there's a need for us to do this work, I want to share these graphics that come from a study that was done a few years ago that really analyzed bird population trends over the last about 55 years, around 1970s when we started doing kind of wide-scale data collection. So this study took all of that information and analyzed it, and really what they found is that we've lost nearly 3 billion birds since 1970. Now, that's a huge number, but to put that into context, that's about a 29% net loss, so nearly a third. That study then broke it down into different habitat types and the species that use those habitats. So we'll focus in today on eastern forest birds. They've experienced about a 17% population decline. But the important thing to note there is that a number of species are affected at a much higher rate. So the example shown is the wood thrush. We've lost about 60% of their population in the last about 55 years. So a really significant decline. Now, this comes from the most recent State of the Birds report, and really what that shows is that unfortunately those declines are really continuing across all habitat types. That State of the Birds report also looked at forest birds that rely on disturbance. Disturbance that creates more complexity within our forests, more canopy gaps and diverse understories, and it really shows that those disturbance-dependent species are continuing to experience steep declines. This highlights that there's a need to use active management to help mimic those disturbances, so that's a lot of what we'll talk about today. Now, that's a lot of doom and gloom, but overall, forest bird population trends are starting to slightly stabilize, especially in areas where there are clear efforts to implement management that will enhance breeding habitat. This example here shows that in areas where the Appalachian Mountains joint venture has focused forest restoration work, we are seeing slow declines and even slight increases in populations for cerulean warblers and wood thrush. So again, this is really highlighting that forest management can be used to restore forest habitat and slow and eventually reverse these population declines. So why are we seeing such declines? The primary driver is a loss of the quantity and the quality of breeding habitat. Now, quantity of habitat is pretty straightforward, right? It's just a loss of forests overall, a loss of forest to land use conversion. But the loss of quality is a little more nuanced, and there's a lot more factors at play. We have things like forest fragmentation, the breaking up of our forest into smaller parcels. This increases our forest edge, which opens up birds to higher rates of predation from things like cats, raccoons, skunks, and also opens them up to kind of unique scenarios. The example shown in the photo is brown-headed cowbird nest parasitism, which the brown-headed cowbird is a species of bird who actually lays its eggs in the nest of a host species, in this case, the nest of a wood thrush. And then the brown-headed cowbird just kind of goes on about its merry way and leaves the eggs there for the wood thrush to deal with. Now, this creates more competition in the nest and lowers overall brood success. And this happens in those highly fragmented landscapes, especially where there's interaction with agricultural lands. We also have interfering vegetation. This refers to our non-native invasive species, things like honeysuckle, buckthorn, Japanese barberry, as well as our native interfering vegetation, things like American beech, where those beech thickets come up after beech bark disease and really kind of outcompete everything else. We have deer overabundance and all the associated browse that comes along with that. It's really hard to have healthy, diverse, regenerating forests when the deer are eating everything in the understory. We have homogeneous forest structures or forests that really all look the same age class. We'll talk about this more, but having structural complexity in the stand is really important to birds. Then we have forest pests, all of the insects and diseases that we deal with, reducing overall forest health. We have climate change that exacerbates a lot of these issues and adds a slew of new challenges as well. We're seeing, more extreme weather patterns, more drought. We're seeing warmer winters, so it's harder to do forest management on frozen grounds. So a lot of challenges. And before we get into how we approach addressing those, I want to discuss some of the benefits of managing for bird habitat. So why should we care about all of this? Birds are indicators of ecosystem health. So when we're seeing these widespread population declines, it's a sign that our forest health is declining as well. Birds are also a charismatic and compelling taxa, and they can really help us inspire action and the positive image of forest management. It's a great tool and lens to look through when we're explaining why forest management is so important. And there's a lot of co-benefits as well. So when we're managing for bird habitat, we can manage for climate resiliency, forest health, water quality, carbon capture, and both timber and non-timber forest products. So when we start to think about managing for birds, we think about it at both a landscape and a stand level. And the reason that this is important is because birds are interacting with more than one forest type. So this graphic really just shows forest succession over time and some of the birds that would use these types of forests. So on the left-hand side, we have our early successional forests, and we have species that use this, including American woodcock, golden-winged warbler, and Canada warbler, and then or prairie warbler. And then on the other side, we have our mature forest where we have black-throated blue warbler, wood thrush, and cerulean warbler. And the important thing to note here is that this relationship isn't static. Birds are actually interacting with more than one forest type on the landscape through the breeding season. So a number of species exhibit what we call patch trading, and this is a pretty simplified graphic to show kind of how that works. And the example shown shows the golden-winged warbler, which is a species that nests in early successional habitat, whether it's young forest or shrubland. And when the young leave the nest or the post-fledging phase, they often move to areas of more dense sapling and pole growth, as well as mature forests with complex understories, places where they can seek more cover. And then on the opposite hand, we have wood thrush, which is a mature forest nesting species that in the post-fledging phase will actually move to areas of young forest for more forage opportunities. So this is showing that it's important to have more than one type of forest age class on the landscape as birds are interacting with both throughout the breeding season. So when we're thinking about management, really the first step for us is to think about what's going on at the landscape scale. Now, from our bird kind of context, we're considering a landscape an area of 2,500 acres. This is what the literature shows that birds are interacting with throughout the breeding season. And on that landscape, we want to have a mix of young forest age class as well as mature forest. So when we're talking about young forests, we're talking about forests that are about age 0, so right after disturbance or harvest, up to about 10 years in age. And that can vary based on site conditions. And then we want mature forests as well, which is about 50 years and older, again, kind of from a bird habitat context. Now, most of the landscape we want to see in that mature forest condition, about 90 to 95%. And then we want about 5 to 10% in the young forest age class, which really, that's not a lot of young forest. If we have a 2,500 acre landscape, all forested, that's only about 250 acres of young forest. But it's about maintaining that on the landscape that's a challenge because it doesn't last for a long time. And that young forest is really important. It accommodates, birds that nest in that area as well as birds that use it in the post-fledging phase. And it's also used a lot during stopover during migration. Those areas usually have a lot of forage, so really important for birds during migration to be able to go find a spot to load up on food. This workflow kind of shows how we figure out how much or what our landscape looks like. So again, if we're working at a parcel, if you're a landowner and you have about 100 acres, you will want to zoom out and look at what's surrounding your parcel first. So we go out to that 2,500 acre area. We're typically doing this on GIS using aerial imagery. You can also use Google Earth, Onyx, whatever you have. And the first step is to figure out how much of that 2,500 acre area is actually forested. From there, you can figure out how much is in the young forest condition and how much is in the mature forest condition. And having that information will help us determine what we want to do at the stand level. Are we lacking young forests? Do we need to create more? Or is there an opportunity to create more? Or is there plenty of young forest on the landscape so we can focus in on enhancing our mature forest? So again, This is just a way for us to kind of inform what we're going to do at that stand level. So moving on to the stand level, there's a number of habitat features that we look to create or improve through management. The first one that I want to discuss is vertical structural diversity. This refers to the layering of vegetation at multiple heights within the stand. Stands with high vertical structural diversity have overstory, midstory, and understory vegetation layers that have a combination of trees, shrubs, herbaceous plants, and even vines. Vertical structural diversity is important because it provides different birds with the places that they need to nest, perch, forage, seek cover, and raise young. Birds are really particular about where they want to hang out in the stand, so having that structural diversity ensures that we can support a full suite of forest birds. Now, structural complexity can be enhanced within the mature forest by creating canopy gaps that stimulate the growth of the understory, so that can then continue to fill in the midstory. This really mimics the disturbance that creates those complex late successional forests. And in general, creating or maintaining this vertical structural diversity is really highly beneficial to a number of forest breeding birds. And then we also want to think about species diversity. So species diversity is important at all layers in the stand. So trees, shrubs, herbaceous plants. And having this species diversity ensures that we have ample food sources from year to year, and it accommodates different nesting site preferences. Our native vegetation provides the most habitat value to wildlife and should be retained or recruited. Aside from directly supporting birds, native plants support all or part of the life cycle of our native insects, which are a primary food source of the majority of forest birds during the breeding season. That's what they're feeding their young while they're in the nest, so those insects are really important. Native trees and shrubs also produce more nutritious mast, the fruits, seeds, and nuts when compared to our non-native invasive species. Again, this is really important. It's really important during the migration as birds are stocking up on that fuel for the dangerous and long migration. Where there's interfering or invasive vegetation that's prohibiting the growth of native tree or shrub species, we want to think about applying control methods to help deal with that and release or promote our native plants instead. So another thing that we want to think about are having large diameter trees within the stand. Large diameter trees offer nesting sites, perches, and places to forage for a number of forest birds, including raptors, owls, and canopy nesting songbirds. For this, we want to see hardwood trees that are at least 24 inches in diameter and softwood trees that are 20 inches in diameter. It's even better if it's a canopy tree as well. So when you're working in a stand, if you have one of those big old trees that maybe doesn't hold a lot of value because it doesn't have a lot of great wood in it anymore, it's starting to rot, that's an awesome tree to leave. That's an awesome wildlife tree. You might also be working in a stand where you don't have any trees this big. So what do? That's where we're looking to retain some of those smaller trees that will eventually grow into these large diameter trees. So kind of thinking about retaining some of those to recruit for later. We also want to think about having softwood inclusion. So softwood inclusions are going to be particularly important in those predominantly hardwood stands. These softwoods provide birds with cover and foraging habitat, and there's a number of birds that prefer to select conifers for nesting. In particular, there are birds that are strongly associated with hemlocks, species like hermit thrush and black-throated green warbler. To benefit forest birds, we want to retain or promote at least some softwoods where they occur. Even a small cluster of less than an acre will add a lot of habitat value. Dead standing trees or snags and cavity trees. I think this is something that a lot of people already equate to wildlife, and birds in particular, and it is really important for birds. It provides nesting, foraging, and roosting sites. We want to see a variety of sizes, but the bigger the better. we like to see at least one snag that's at least 18 inches in diameter and like at least three that are over 12, with the goal of having at least six snags or cavity trees per acre. Now, again, you might be working in a stand where you don't have a lot of snags or cavity trees, so there's options there. You can think about creating snags through girdling or just looking to retain trees that may become larger snags or cavity trees later on. And this is still something that's important to do in clear cuts or seed tree sites. Keeping some of those cavity trees and snag trees as reserves will add a lot of habitat value. Now, downwoody material kind of works in the same way. It provides a lot of foraging sites, nesting sites, areas for birds to find cover, and we want to have a variety of size classes on the ground as well as stages of decay. Some larger down logs are great to have. Stuff that's about 18 inches and bigger are really important for species like ruffed grouse. They use them for their drumming displays. And from, a management standpoint, it can be really easy to increase the downwoody material on the ground. If you're planning some sort of harvest, looking to implement cut-to-length systems where we can leave treetops or other slash, leaving any poor quality logs or cull material on the ground can really increase that downwoody material. And then the last condition I want to talk about is leaf litter. This isn't maybe something we think about a lot when we're thinking about forest management, but this is a really important source of invertebrates for ground foragers. So species like wood thrush will actually search for invertebrates in the leaf litter, and they do their foraging right there on the ground. So important for species like that. Leaf litter also protects the soil moisture and enriches the soil. This again is going to be important in those predominantly hardwood stands. And you often kind of have leaf litter or you don't. And in those places where you're maybe lacking the leaf litter, there's a couple of options from a management standpoint. The main one being if you're doing some sort of harvest or operation, you have heavy machinery in the woods, really kind of reducing the amount of skid trails, keeping it below 10% of the total harvest area if possible. And then again, doing forest management when the ground is frozen can help protect the leaf litter as well. So that was a quick run through of stand conditions, but I also want to discuss a few silvicultural techniques that can be applied when we're thinking about bird-friendly forest management. We can apply even-age silviculture or uneven-age silviculture depending on our goals. Typically, we will want to look to even age techniques when we're looking to establish more young forests on the landscape. So, say we did our landscape scale assessment, we figured out we don't have that 5 to 10%, and we've got a great opportunity to create young forests. We might look to implement things like shelter wood with reserves, clear cut with reserves, seed tree harvests. There's also some lighter touch management options like just maintaining young forest on fallow agricultural land, so letting it go into succession. And maybe that looks like also doing some brush hogging or coming in with a masticator on a rotating basis to keep that young forest on the landscape. When we want to enhance the structural complexity of our mature forest, we can look to uneven age techniques. So we might implement things like small group selection, single tree selection, variable retention thinnings, those techniques that really mimic natural disturbance and help move towards that uneven age structure. We could implement crop tree release or timber stand improvement. Really, I just want to highlight here that there are a lot of options out there, and we can apply traditional silvicultural systems to achieve the conditions that benefit forest birds. To really drive home how we approach management, I want to walk through a sample stand scenario and talk through a potential prescription option. So for this stand, we're dealing with a pretty classic degraded hardwood, northern hardwood stand. We're saying it's about 30 to 50 years old, fully stocked, and we're going to call it mature from a forest bird perspective. It's comprised of mixed hardwoods with a high American beech density. We have over 50% unacceptable growing stock and little to no understory regeneration. We also looked at the landscape context, and we found that there was at least 5 to 10% of the landscape already in the young forest condition. So, with that in mind, we looked at the landscape and we determined that we have enough young forest on the landscape. So, instead of creating more young forest, we're going to focus in on increasing the vertical structural diversity of the stand. So, one potential option is to convert the stand from an uneven age stand or convert it to an uneven age stand using group selection. So, we could create openings that are a quarter of an acre up to maybe 3/4 of an acre in size and use thinning in between as well. We can conduct multiple entries and continue to enhance that structure over time. Again, with those canopy openings scattered throughout the stand to really mimic that natural disturbance. And that thinning in between the groups really allows us to focus in on removing some of that unacceptable growing stock and promote better forest health overall. When we're doing this type of management, there's still other considerations to think about. We want to think about retaining those large diameter trees for nesting and forage. Now, this was a pretty young stand, about 30 to 50 years old. So you might not have those trees that are 24 inches in diameter for hardwoods or 20 inches in diameter for softwoods. So maybe we want to think about just retaining stuff that's over 15 inches in diameter that we can kind of recruit to be those large diameter trees in the future. We also want to think about retaining or promoting snags and cavity trees and downwoody material. So maybe in our prescription, we write not to remove any snags unless we have to. Maybe we go out and actually mark cavity trees as wildlife trees to be retained. For our downwoody material, implementing something like a cut to length system or just really making sure to leave slash and treetops and coal material on the ground. And then here it's also going to be really important to control that invasive vegetation. We know that there was a high American beech density within the stand, so we would be expecting a lot of beech regeneration to come back in those groups. So making sure we have a plan to control that interfering vegetation so we get more diverse and more desirable regeneration. Again, this is just one option. The one thing I really want to highlight is that it's important to take that landscape assessment into consideration as you make that stand level decision. You might not always be able to create young forest if you need young forest, but still something to think about. And also really thinking about what the long-term goals are for the stand and making sure you're thinking about a plan to achieve that. So if you want to promote regeneration, but you have a lot of interfering vegetation, or deer browse is heavy in that region, really thinking about what you're going to do to control that so that you can actually get the proper regeneration to move towards that uneven age structure or increase that vertical structural diversity. So moving on from management, I want to highlight some of the work that we're doing within the forest program. And this work does include some opportunities for financial assistance for implementation of forest management. The first opportunity I want to discuss is a grant that we have that's focused in the Delaware River watershed. You can tell from the map here that it's primarily in Delaware and Sullivan counties in New York. We're also working with Audubon Mid-Atlantic, another regional office of Audubon, who's kind of handling the work on the Pennsylvania side. Now, this is funded by the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. We're working with, as I mentioned, Audubon Mid-Atlantic, Ruffed Grouse, DEC, and within this we have financial assistance available to pass through to foresters, loggers, and landowners who are looking to implement forest management and improves breeding habitat for our priority species. So we use priority species as kind of umbrella species. to dictate what types of management we're looking to achieve. In this case, we're using wood thrush, cerulean warbler, and golden winged warbler, which on my next slide, I'll go into some specifics of what that type of management looks like. But that financial assistance that's available could cover a number of different types of projects, from timber stand improvement or other non-commercial work. It could be work that's coupled with a commercial timber sale, things like invasive and interfering vegetation control, maybe deer browse prevention measures. So a lot of opportunities there to implement projects that could benefit these birds and have that work paid for. Now, this grant runs through November 2027, so we have quite a bit of time, or a decent bit of time left on it. Again, we have identified 3 priority species that are kind of guiding the types of management that qualify for that funding. We have golden winged warbler. This is a species that has experienced really significant population declines. This is a species that nests in early successional habitat. Could be young forest, it could be shrublands. They require a lot of kind of complexity within that stand. They still need to have some overstory trees, kind of irregularly spaced, but no more than 10 to 30% canopy cover. They need to have a big shrub layer, again, that's kind of all messy and interspersed, but 30 to 70% of the stand, and the rest needs to be herbaceous cover. Things like goldenrod are really great for this species, and they need to be found in a predominantly deciduous forest landscape. And they need areas that are pretty large, at least 5 acres. This is a species where we actually want to see more young forests on the ground than that classic 5 to 10% that we aim for. For this species, we might even go up to 20% young forests on the ground. Then we also have cerulean warbler, another species that's experienced really significant population declines. This is a mature forest nesting species. They like mature forest, but a forest that has a lot of canopy gaps. They like white oaks and hickories and sugar maples. You'll often find them nesting in a large tree near one of those canopy gaps. You're aiming to have a residual basal area between 40 and 90 square feet per acre. And this species likes more understory than midstory. So that's where those canopy gaps come in, help promote that understory. And this is actually a species that uses grapevine to build its nest. So that's one where we would want to be careful about removing all of the grapevine from a stand and making sure we leave some for this to use for its nesting. And then wood thrush is another mature forest nesting species. They like a large intact forest block, at least 200 acres in size. Tall, closed canopy, but they still need that structural diversity, especially in the mid-story. That's where they build their nest. And again, they use that leaf litter for foraging. They forage for insects there. And all of these species have a slightly different post-fledging phase, usually that kind of young forest or a dense pole stand. And then that golden winged warbler also uses that mature forest that has complex understories. So some basic guidelines for these species. What I will say is that we don't expect you, if you're interested in implementing a project to benefit these species, we're not necessarily expecting you to be the expert and know exactly how to do this management. That's our role in this. We're here to provide that technical expertise and all of that advice on how to implement this type of management. So we can review prescriptions, review forest management plans, come out to visit the site if needed. So we'll help you figure out exactly how to implement management that will benefit these species. The next grant I want to talk about is focused more in northern New York. Again, this is funded by the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. We're working on it in partnership with Audubon, Vermont, and Connecticut. And again, we have financial assistance available for implementation. For this grant, we have a big focus on young forest creation. but there is a bit of flexibility for mature forest work as well. But here our priority species are wood thrush, woodcock, and golden winged warbler. So a lot of overlap there. And this grant runs through the end of February 2027. So about a year left on this one. So we have that golden winged warbler and wood thrush again, so I won't go over that again, but we also have woodcock, which is another young forest nesting species. This is a species that's really interesting to manage for because they need a lot of different things in close proximity. And they need at least a 5 acre block of young forest with dense sapling growth for their nesting site, but it needs to be in close proximity to a wetland. They use that long beak to probe for insects in wet soil. And then all of this also needs to be in close proximity to their roosting and singing grounds. So their singing grounds are areas with sparser cover, again, close to that feeding site and nesting site. That doesn't need to be as big, maybe a half an acre in size. And then there needs to be a roosting area, so an area with more cover that's at least 5 acres in size. So a really interesting species to manage for. But again, this grant has a lot of focus on young forest species. Next steps, if you're interested in taking advantage of this opportunity, we're really in the stage of gathering ideas and setting priorities. We want to fund as many projects as possible, but we do unfortunately have a limited amount of funding. So the sooner we have information on potential projects, the better. That way we can determine how to best distribute the funding. So again, we're here to provide that technical assistance and talk through how to implement management that will benefit these species. We're available to review prescriptions and forest management plans and come out to the site as needed. If this is something that you're interested in, if you have potential ideas or maybe just some questions, the next step would just be reach out to me via email and we can talk through some potential ideas. And then I want to just quickly go over a couple of the other programs that we work on within the forest program. The first one is our bird friendly maple program, which maybe you've heard about, maybe you haven't, but this is a program where we work with maple producers to help them implement management in their sugar bush that will improve habitat for forest birds. So we'll go out to a maple producer's property and walk the stand and look at a number of stand characteristics. We'll collect some inventory data and we'll use all of that to write a habitat management plan or work with their forester to incorporate it into their forest management plan if they have one. And we'll write management recommendations for how to achieve some different guidelines. The guidelines for this program are really focused on increasing structural diversity and tree species diversity within the stand. Once a producer agrees to work towards implementing that management, they become a recognized bird-friendly maple producer. And from us, they receive some marketing materials, which includes a sign for their sugar house, as well as some bottle labels. The little logo on the map here is what those stickers look like. They're also listed on our website, and we're working on a really great interactive map where people can figure out who produces bird-friendly maple in their region and how they can buy it. So it's a really cool way for producers to set their product apart and be recognized for intentional efforts to incorporate conservation into their business. It's a great way to attract consumers who are interested in using their buying power to support conservation. So this has been a really fun program to work on. The program did originally start in Vermont over 10 years ago now and has expanded throughout the Northeast. It's active in Vermont, New York, Connecticut, Maine, Massachusetts, and Wisconsin, is also spreading to Pennsylvania and Minnesota. In New York, we have currently 29 participants, over 3,000 acres enrolled, so 3,000 acres under improved habitat management. For the entire program, I think we're almost up to 150 producers and almost 20,000 acres enrolled in under improved habitat management. So, really making a pretty big impact, which is exciting. And then we also have our Audubon Forester Training and Endorsement Program. This is a program where we work with foresters to teach them how to incorporate bird habitat management into their work. We either have a four-part online webinar series that foresters can watch just on their own time, or we also hold in-person trainings as well. The training really discusses a lot of what we talked about today, but does go into a lot more detail, especially into the applications of silvicultural practices. Once foresters complete the training, they have the option to continue on to receive an official endorsement from Audubon that says that they can apply the concepts taught in the training. In order to receive the endorsement, foresters have to go through a couple of additional steps after the training. They have to write an example silvicultural prescription that takes into that landscape context. They also have to submit two bird-friendly forest management plans for review. Once we review those and it's clear that the forester can demonstrate that they can apply these concepts, they receive the official endorsement. And this is really a great way to connect landowners who are interested in this type of work with foresters who have the skill set to help them. So if you are a forester who's interested in this program, or maybe a landowner who's interested in working with an Audubon endorsed forester, I'm happy to share more information about that program. And then finally, I just want to share some additional resources that are available out there. I know I went over a lot of information today, but we have all of this really synthesized into some really great guides. Audubon, New York, we have a forest management guide, both a landowner's guide as well as a forester's guide that goes into a little more detail and has some sample silvicultural prescriptions in it and scenarios. There's also some really great species specific guides available. So if you're interested in doing management for something like woodcock or golden winged warbler, there's some awesome, really detailed guides that go over all of that habitat. So I'm happy to share those resources for anyone who is interested. And then that finally, here is my contact information again. So if you have questions about that financial assistance opportunity, Bird Friendly Maple, Audubon training and endorsement, or any of those resources, happy to share all of that stuff. And the QR code here does link to our Forester's Guide that's available for download online. Thank you so much. I think we have plenty of time for some questions. So I will stop sharing this. And come back on camera.
Great job, Claire. That was phenomenal.
Good.
And great job for the questions. And Suzanne was doing amazing job keeping up with all of the questions that, maybe not all of the questions, but a lot of the questions that came in. So this was really a fun kind of dynamic. So this is the chance when you all have maybe some additional questions that you want to ask Claire or Suzanne. Suzanne is a forester that works with Audubon New York as well, so that's why I was happy that she was here and very happy to um, get her engaged in some of the questions. So Claire, you want me to zoom back or scroll back rather and read questions? Is that still going
Yeah,
to work out
that
best
would
for
be
you?
great.
Okay.
Yep.
So way back. And I tried to make a mental note of the ones that Suzanne was responding to. Okay. There's a question about considering the middle-aged forest, the 10 to 50 that Suzanne responded to. Suzanne also responded to a report. One of the participants thought there were some differences in the target for percentage of the forest in young forest. So Suzanne responded to that.
I do see a
Uh,
question here that I could pull back up where
sure.
someone just asked to repeat the grant for Connecticut, Vermont, New York. So let me pull that slide back up so we can see that. All right. So I didn't see if there was a specific question about it, but this is the Northeast Forests and Rivers Fund. Again, we're working in New York, Vermont, and Connecticut. I'm responsible for the New York side of it. We have that financial assistance available for implementing forest management practices that benefit wood thrush, woodcock, and golden-winged warbler. It could cover a number of different types of management as long as they play into those management guidelines for those priority species, which to show that again are these three. Again, there's a big focus on young forest management for this grant, so things like golden winged warbler or American woodcock, but there is a bit of flexibility to do some mature forest work as well. And I have all of these guidelines in a document as well that I could share with folks. So if you're interested in that, just reach out to me and I can share that.
Okay. So there is a question. I don't think Suzanne responded to it. Somebody was asking about worms in leaf litter and if that's an issue in New York. I've seen it a few places, but what's your experience with worm impact in the forest?
That's a great question and something that we've heard a lot about, the invasive jumping worms eating all of the leaf litter. I will say that I have not come across it in New York yet. Um, I don't have a great answer for how we're going to deal with that, unfortunately, but it's starting to be a concern. Hopefully, there will be ways where we can kind of slow the spread of that species, but we don't have a lot of recommendations at this point, and not something I've experienced too much across New York State at all.
Okay. Quinn wants to know if you have any experiences or observations or reactions. So you set the lower edge of mature at 50 years. What about when you get into those 150-year-old stands? Is that just all the more better or like what's happening there?
It can be really variable, right? Sometimes we'll go into those older stands that are 100 plus years, and they'll already have kind of some of those later successional conditions that we're looking for, more of that structural complexity, which is great. And we would want to just kind of continue to encourage that. But also in those stands, we might experience a lot of the same challenges we experience in other areas, whether it's invasive or interfering vegetation, threats from forest pests and diseases. So there's still a lot to think about. Deer browse is a huge one. Those stands are not immune to deer browse. So continuing to monitor those challenges and think about addressing those as well.
Okay. So Edward wants to know where he can find a detailed map of the Delaware watershed project. He's in Shenango County, New York. So
Um,
should he just get a hold of you with his address, or is that the best?
Yeah, I can either confirm an address or I can share a map, or if you are someone who has access to GIS, I can share a shapefile, but a lot of options. The easiest one probably is to just share an address with me and I can confirm whether or not you fall within the geography.
Okay. So he can email you, and I put your email in a minute ago, and I'll do it again.
Yeah, and if
Audubon,
someone loses my
Audubon,
email,
it's audubon.org, right?
correct.
Okay,
If someone loses my email too, if you Google Audubon New York forest work, you'll find staff and you'll find my email somewhere on the website too.
perfect. All right. Of course, that means I just lost my spot in the questions when I typed that in. Here we go. Oh, so there was at one point you were talking about the vertical layering, vertical structure, and Carol's asking about burning bush that they've been trying to trying to eliminate an understory of euonymus. Any gain in keeping some of that as a understory layer, or
When,
try to move towards a native species maybe?
yeah, whenever possible, we want to um, promote native species. Sometimes, for example, I'll be working on a property and there's a lot in the mid-story, but it's all just one species. Maybe I run into it being honeysuckle or Japanese barberry. And one thing that we talk about a lot, because those species, they're still providing some structure, they're still providing some food. It's just not ideal. We can think about a phased approach to dealing with it. If you have a 50-acre stand, starting to do management in half of it or a quarter of it and work on promoting that native to kind of fill that gap so you still have the structure, you still have the food source, but you're working towards the better food source. So that's kind of an option as the phased approach to handling that.
Okay. Kennedy has a question about who's eligible for the Maple program. So are
That's a
there, so they're like, I'm not sure where Kennedy's from. There's reference to a certified Maple business versus private. So I'm not sure what, but just are there any restrictions on who can participate?
that's a great question and something that I did forget to kind of go over. As far as the bird friendly maple program goes, technically anyone is eligible. We don't require that there is a minimum sugar bush acreage size. So producers in the program might only tap a couple of acres. We also have producers who tap hundreds of acres. The one thing that we do require, regardless of sugar bush size, is that it's part of a larger forest block. So say you tap 10 acres, we need it to be part of a 200-acre forest block. You don't have to own that 200 acres. It just needs to exist there. And the reason that's a guideline that we have or a requirement that we have is that a lot of the species that we're targeting to support through this program are what we call interior forest birds, and they need that large block of forest to be successful through the breeding season. So we're really focusing our efforts on those areas where that condition can be met. Um, but that's the main one. And really the other requirement is that you are willing to implement the management recommendations that we give.
Okay. Teresa wants to know about a little more detail on the Audubon Forester program, if it's self-paced, what's the time frame to become a Audubon Forester, some of that.
So with the Forester program, there's two options. We do hold in-person trainings. We try to have at least one in New York and one in Connecticut every year. But we also at any time have the webinars available on our website. So there's 4 1-hour long webinars to watch, and those are self-paced. You can do them whenever you have time. And there's associated questions to answer that you would send to us that really just proves that you watched them. Um, and then again, on your own time, you would submit that sample silvicultural prescription as well as 2 forest management plans. With the forest management plans, they can be either new plans that you write as they kind of pop up, or you can go back to a plan that you've written in the past and make edits to make it more bird friendly. Just again, demonstrating that you can apply the concepts taught in the training. So, with it being self-paced, it really the timeline depends on what you have time for, what you want to do. We don't require that you have to submit plans within a certain amount of time from watching the webinars or taking the training. So sometimes we have foresters who get it done really quick. Sometimes we have foresters who we've been, working with for a year to get it done. So it's totally kind of dependent on your schedule.
So Dave is in the Greene County, Albany County area. He wants to know, where did all the ovenbirds go? Did
That's
something
it.
happen to ovenbirds?
Not necessarily that I'm aware of. Suzanne, you might have an answer to this. I don't know off the top of my head if oven burns are something that are in decline or they're pretty stable. I think they're pretty stable. I hear them a lot in the spring. It can just depend on the conditions of your forest, maybe just on your site, but for the most part, I think they're stable across the region.
So it may just be an observational thing on Dave's part that seems
Yep.
like the perception. So, all right. So Kennedy, who asked about the maple, program, and maybe I missed this because I was reading questions while you were talking. I apologize. They don't sell the product, but they tap the trees. So can they still be reach out to Audubon to do something with bird-friendly maple?
Yeah, so that's a scenario. I'd have to get a little bit more information from you, Kennedy, but we can still kind of recognize your sugar bush, absolutely. Um if you're selling sap to somebody or selling syrup to somebody else who then sells it, they don't necessarily get to label it bird friendly if they're mixing it with other syrup or other sap. So it depends a little bit on the full structure. If you want to reach out, I can share more information about kind of how all of that works. But if you want just your sugar bush recognized and don't necessarily want the marketing benefit of selling it as a labeled syrup, we can absolutely do that.
So the Kennedy says that the family taps, but they don't sell any of the products. So my interpretation is they want to know that they're doing good by birds. So they want
Yep.
to have that kind of um, affirmation.
Yeah, there's a number of producers that we have who just make it for themselves and they just want to know that they're doing the right thing in the woods. And, we love that. So we're happy to have you be part of the program as well.
So this is Linda from Rockland County, so downstate New York. Wants to know if there are programs that extend the forest management to include wetland restoration. So you need wetlands kind of angles from Audubon on programs like I'm assuming cost share programs or funding options.
We don't have a ton of like additional programs specific to wetlands necessarily. From like a forest management standpoint, we're not super involved in that because for the most part, if we're near a wetland, we're trying to buffer it, and kind of maintain what's going on there. But no additional programs that I'm aware of like on our end.
Okay. Borea wants to know where he can obtain copies of the Audubon publications on forest management. So Suzanne posted a link to the Forester publication, I think. So are they on the Audubon website? Where would they find them?
Yep, they're on the Audubon website. So if you Google Audubon New York forest management for birds, you should find a landowner's and a forester's guide. Again, if you're having a hard time finding it right on the website, you can just shoot me an email and I'll send them to you. They're available for free download on there.
Okay. Alex wants to know how you assess forest age. I'm assuming stand age of a forest at a 2,500 acre scale with GIS. Is that just to use a height profile, or what's the strategy there?
So it depends on what kind of available layers we have within GIS. Some areas we're starting to get more LiDAR information on tree height and stuff like that. That's amazing if we have that and can be really specific. But I would say for the most part, we're doing pretty basic, looking at the aerial imagery, most recent aerial imagery if possible, figuring out is there an obvious area where there's been some sort of harvest or disturbance. Sometimes you can kind of get a feel if there's some fallow agricultural land that's gone into succession that you can count as young forest. I will say that it's far from an exact science. When we're just looking at aerial imagery, you don't ever really fully know what's going on the ground. And you're often looking at a large area that you don't have access to all of that. So there's no way to ground truth it. So that's why a lot of this has a little bit of a range, right? That 5 to 10%. And you do your best with the estimate and kind of go from there. I often find that I'm usually either way below or way above, and I'm not often really straddling that line. So it's not an exact science, but we can still use it to kind of inform our decisions. Hopefully, at some point, we'll have more access to LiDAR and better technology, but for now, it's pretty basic.
So Matthew wants to know if you have resources, I'm assuming to identify, name, describe northeast forest birds that are beneficial for agricultural operations. So like that interface between forest and ag. Does that ring a bell?
Could you read what was the first half of the question again?
So it was resource. So the way it's written, Matthew says, do you have any resources for beneficial forest birds in the Northeast for different agricultural operations or agricultural crops? So I'm assuming like a list of birds that are beneficial in agricultural situations.
Okay.
So from a
I don't.
pest control, I'm not sure. So
Yeah, that's a good question that I don't have an answer to. I could maybe try to look up and share some resources if you wanted to reach out. Suzanne, did you hear that? Do you have any additional insights into that? She might be focused on
she
answering
might be
questions.
right.
So.
And if she's answering, she's at the bottom of the slide, and
Yep.
I'm still at 1247
Yeah, which
in the queue. So
Matthew, that's yeah, not a great answer, frankly. I don't have a great answer, but if you wanted to reach out and maybe give more specifics into what you're looking for, I can certainly try to help connect you with any resources. I'm just not sure of any off the top of my head.
okay. Diane wants to know how long after creating a patch cut in a mature forest would you expect to see species return? For example, American woodcock.
Great. Hi, Diane. I went out to Diane's property
Okay.
last spring, last fall. It's been a little bit now, but it depends. So something like American woodcock is a species that does need pretty dense sapling growth to kind of have that amount of cover that they like. So they're a species that's really going to show up at that later end of the 10 years and persist even longer than that as well. So they kind of stretch the boundary of that young forest. As far as other species, you have certain species that show up right after harvest or right after disturbance that might stick around for a year or two and then move on, species that come in the middle. So there's a spectrum across that whole 10 years where you're supporting different birds.
David has a 27-acre brush lot that's been transitioning from wild apple and goldenrod to hardwoods over the last 25 years. Are there opportunities to manage this for birds?
Yeah, so that kind of falls into that intermediate category that I didn't talk a lot about because doesn't hold as much value as the young forest or the mature forest, but there's still things that you can think about from a management perspective. Um, Depending on kind of what size your saplings are, you can start to think about doing a crop tree release, stuff like that to kind of shift the structure or species over time. It's also an opportunity if you wanted to keep it in a younger state to go back in and do a treatment. But there are some tweaks that you can do in those intermediate stages to make them better as they progress towards that mature state where they would hold a little more value. But crop tree release is one that comes to top of mind, or controlling invasives or anything like that, just keeping up on that kind of stuff.
So James is curious, and maybe he can send an email if you don't know off the top of your head. He wants to know who's the contact for similar programs in northeastern Pennsylvania.
So that would either be, so we have Audubon Mid-Atlantic, it's another regional program, Scott Parkhill or Josh Rittenhouse. I can share information on their contact information if you want to reach out to me.
Okay. Sean wants to know, so I don't know if Suzanne did this, but share the page with all the books again. So is there was that a slide you had that
Yeah,
had a picture of?
this slide, I can pull that back up. So Suzanne shared some of these that are available
Oh,
on the
okay. Yep.
Audubon website. Some of these are also they've been updated since this, some of the species specific management, but there's guides that we have in New York, there's guides in Connecticut, Vermont, and then some of those species specific guides. Things for like golden winged warbler, there's guides for depending on what region of the state you're in, because there's kind of the Great Lakes population and the Appalachian population. So a couple different things, but lots of resources out there that I'm happy to follow up and share if these are of interest.
Great. James wants to know if Audubon, New Hampshire is also doing landowner outreach.
That's a great question that I don't have a super clear answer to. So, Audubon gets a little bit confusing because multiple states use Audubon in their name, but they might not be actually associated officially with National Audubon Society. So, Connecticut and New York's program is part of National Audubon Society. New Hampshire is an independent state program. So I don't have as much insight on what they're doing. I do have some contacts there. I know that they have pretty limited staff, but I can absolutely share the contacts that I have if you're interested in connecting with Audubon in New Hampshire.
Derek wants to know if Audubon has foresters on staff to work with landowners for management plans in areas where there is a lack of private consulting foresters.
So, I mean, that's a little bit of what my position is going out and providing technical assistance. I'm not necessarily going to be able to write you a full forest management plan. I can still come out and do a site visit and talk through some of the habitat conditions and talk through some specific bird-friendly management, but I'm not available to write a full forest management plan for you. Depending on where you are, maybe we could connect you with an Audubon endorsed forester or kind of help make some contacts with some consulting foresters that we know in your region, because I know it can be difficult sometimes depending on where you're at.
So Carol has a follow-up to the burning bush question. The deer take our planted natives, browse them, I'm assuming the browse the natives after the burning bush is removed. Is there deer protection that allows bird habitat?
Yeah, deer browse is a huge concern when we're thinking about regeneration. A few options. I mean, tree tubes or caging are always an option. It depends on kind of the scale at which you're doing it because that can be really labor intensive as well as very expensive. Deer fencing is another option as well. Deer fencing certainly doesn't inhibit birds and promotes regeneration. And then, Peter's obviously the expert on slash walls as an option as well. So really any of those would be good. All depends on kind of the scale at which you're looking to protect regeneration.
Uh, Gail wants to know if climate change is affecting New York bird territories and perhaps also is it affecting what invasive species are coming in?
I don't have a great answer on the territories specifically. I mean, it does, especially birds who are maybe affected by weather and elevation and things like that. It might be shrinking some territories and things like that. But it's certainly having an effect. I could share more resources if you want to get into more specifics. I just don't have a ton to share right now. And then with invasives, yeah, absolutely, climate change is affecting the spread of invasives as well. They're often more drought tolerant, things like that. They have longer growing seasons a lot of times. As you're driving around in the spring, you might notice things greening up sooner. And a lot of the times that's your invasive species. They're just really well adapted to grow in suboptimal conditions where our native species aren't. So as the climate's changing, it's really just kind of speeding up that process.
So James has heard that coyotes will eat smaller nest predators and thus help bird populations. Are you aware that there's any truth to that?
I actually just saw somebody make a video about this, which maybe it was the same way that James learned about it. Um, I don't have, a ton of information or background on that, but it does make sense that, coyotes are targeting some of those smaller mammals that might go after birds, so could absolutely be beneficial to birds in that way.
Okay. So there were dozens of comments that said great job, more, I mean, like different versions of great job. So you can pat yourself on the back. Ricky says, what species of birds suffer the most with the loss of habitat from the impact of the loss of, so with the loss of low grade markets, so you got this overabundance of low grade, what birds have suffered the most?
That's a really good question and a really good consideration that I think a lot of people don't think about a ton when we're thinking about habitat management is the impact of the forest industry and how important it is to have a market for products so that we're able to do this work, especially low grade stuff. Because as you could probably tell from the presentation, a lot of the things we're targeting would be harvests that are non-commercial or require having some of that low grade market. I don't have a specific like list of species necessarily. As a whole, it's going to be a lot of those species who are disturbance dependent, the species that really require that vertical structural diversity, all of that complexity in the stand. So pretty much all of the species we talked about today, wood thrush, cerulean warbler, golden winged warbler, American woodcock, all of those, because they really require that disturbance and that complexity. And right now, our way to do that is through forest management. And a lot of that is taking a really degraded stand and trying to make it healthier. And in order to do that, we need that low grade market. So it's definitely having an impact on what we're able to achieve on the ground, which again is why we are working hard to offer financial assistance to kind of cover that gap where people can't feasibly do commercial work on their property.
Okay. And Tyler wants to know if the ways that it may be possible to incorporate these bird habitat practices that you've described into a community forest setting. So a forest that's managed as part of a community effort.
Yeah, so this is something that's definitely come up more. Typically Suzanne and I are working in these like large forested landscapes, but we've had interest from people who are doing more urban forestry or thinking about forestry like within their community. And not all of it's going to be applicable. One thing that we really lift up is the importance of like migratory stopover habitat, the importance of promoting native plants and trees, so that we have those better food sources and all of those things. So there's still a lot of little tweaks that you can make in kind of that community forest or an urban forest setting, but a little more focused on that stopover habitat more so than breeding habitat. Because breeding habitat, we really still need to support those large forest blocks for species that really need that, but still super important to do that work other places.
Okay. Great job, Claire. That was the end of the questions.
Woo!
Super, super, very impressed with your like pivoting between questions and adapting and thinking about how things tie together. So, and thanks to Suzanne is still busy in the background responding to the chat questions. So, and to the audience, great questions. That makes it all the more fun for Claire and Suzanne to have this kind of dialogue and interaction. So we very much appreciate you doing that. You hit 278 participants at the peak. So great job. Now, some
Awesome.
of those, I will send a full detailed report within a week or two, um, just so you have it for your records, and it lays out lots of metrics. So you'll have those. So thank you, Claire. If anybody wants to see the same presentation again tonight at 7 o'clock, you're all welcome back. So
Awesome. Thank you, Peter. Thank you,
yes,
everybody.
thank you. Thank you. See you at 7.
Right.